The weight of the badge. Cynthia Taylor navigated the bustling airport terminal with a purposeful stride, her well-worn suitcase trailing behind her. To the untrained eye, she appeared unremarkable. A middle-aged woman in a tailored yet understated suit, her dark skin glowing faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights. But Cynthia wasn't just any traveler. She was an admiral in the United States Navy, on her way to an international security summit that would define the next decade of global diplomacy. Today wasn't a day for prestige or ego, however. It was a day of urgency, one that demanded her presence and sharpest focus. The summit wasn't just a routine meeting of world leaders. It was a gathering where strategies for global stability would be discussed in the face of rising threats. Yet as she stood in line at the check-in counter, the weight of her purpose seemed invisible to those around her. She observed the travelers ahead of her, a harried mother trying to coddle her children, a pair of business people engrossed in their phones, and a group of backpackers laughing over plans for their next destination. Cynthia's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the hurried chaos around her. Years of military training had honed her ability to maintain composure, even in the most chaotic situations. When it was her turn, she approached the counter and handed over her ticket and identification. The airline attendant, a woman with a sharp gaze and an air of impatience, barely glanced at Cynthia before taking her documents. But as the attendant examined the military ID in her hand, her expression shifted. Her eyes flicked back up to Cynthia's face, hesitation and suspicion clouding her features. "Is this your flight?" the woman asked, her voice polite yet tinged with doubt. Cynthia met her gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Yes, I'm on flight 724 to Washington, D.C. first class," she replied, her voice measured and steady. The attendant scrutinized the ID card again, holding it up to the light as if looking for signs of forgery. It was a routine Cynthia had grown all too familiar with, being questioned, doubted, even scrutinized, despite her impeccable credentials. In civilian clothes, she didn't look the part of a high-ranking naval officer, and her identity was often questioned because of it. "Just a moment," the attendant said, gesturing to a younger colleague nearby. A tall man with an uncertain expression joined her, glancing at Cynthia and then at the ID card. They exchanged a look that spoke volumes, their shared skepticism palpable. "Is there a problem?" Cynthia asked, her tone even but with an undercurrent of frustration. The man, whose name had agreed John, studied the ID as if it might reveal some hidden truth. "It's unusual," he muttered, more to himself than to Cynthia. "Unusual," Cynthia repeated, the irritation she had worked so hard to suppress threatening to surface. "I'm Admiral Cynthia Taylor of the United States Navy, traveling on official business. My credentials are valid, and I would appreciate it if you expedited this process. I'm on a tight schedule." The two airline employees exchanged another glance, their unease evident. John handed back the ID, muttering something unintelligible before stepping back. Cynthia, unwilling to let the moment escalate, took her ID with a steady hand and slid it into her wallet. She was used to these encounters, but their persistence wore on her. Before she could turn to leave, a man in a crisp airline uniform approached the counter, his air of authority silencing the tension in the air. His sharp eyes scanned Cynthia and then the ID in the attendant's hand. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. The attendant stammered, clearly caught off guard. "No issue, sir. Just confirming the passenger's identity." The man's gaze softened as he looked at Cynthia. "Admiral Taylor, I presume." Cynthia nodded. "That's correct." "Apologies for the delay," he said, addressing her directly. Then, turning to the attendant and John, he added firmly, "She's cleared. Please process her immediately." The shift in their demeanor was instantaneous. The attendant plastered on a polite smile, her earlier skepticism replaced with a flustered eagerness to comply. John stepped aside, his previous confidence now replaced with quiet embarrassment. Cynthia thanked the man in the airline uniform, with a curt nod before collecting her boarding pass and heading toward security. As she walked away, her composure remained intact, but the familiar sting of the encounter lingered. This wasn't the first time her authority had been questioned, and it likely wouldn't be the last. It was the unspoken challenge of her life, one she had faced since the beginning of her career. Proving herself, not because of her skills or expertise, but because of the assumptions others made about her appearance. Once she reached the security checkpoint, Cynthia handed over her documents without a word. The process went smoothly, but the sting of the earlier encounter remained. She couldn't help but reflect on how easily people dismissed her achievements, reducing her to a mere face in the crowd. She was Admiral Cynthia Taylor, a trailblazer in her field, but to some, she was just another traveler to be doubted. As she settled into a seat in the first-class lounge, she allowed herself a brief moment of introspection. Her thoughts drifted to the path that had brought her here, a path paved with relentless determination and a refusal to let the doubts of others define her. From her earliest days at the Naval Academy, she had faced skepticism and bias, but she had risen through the ranks on her own merit, proving time and again that she belonged. Today's summit was a reminder of the stakes she carried with her. In a few short hours, she would stand before the most powerful military and diplomatic leaders in the world, leading discussions on strategies that could shape the future. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly, and despite the frustrations of the day, she was ready to meet it head-on. For Cynthia, resilience wasn't just a trait, it was a way of life. As she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, she reminded herself of the words her father had once told her. You walk into every room like you belong there because you do. It was a mantra she had carried with her throughout her life, and it was one she would carry with her now as she prepared to step onto the global stage. No amount of doubt or skepticism could change the truth of who she was. She had earned her place, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The journey to leadership. As the plane ascended into the sky, Cynthia Taylor leaned back in her seat and gazed out the window, the sprawling city below shrinking into a mosaic of lights. She welcomed the solitude the flight offered, a rare moment to reflect amid the chaos of her responsibilities. The summit ahead loomed large in her mind, but it wasn't just the international stage that occupied her thoughts. It was the long road that had led her here, a journey marked by trials, triumphs, and an unyielding determination to break barriers. Cynthia's path to becoming admiral was anything but conventional. She grew up in a small town in Mississippi, the daughter of a Vietnam War veteran and a schoolteacher. Her parents instilled in her an ironclad sense of discipline and an unwavering belief in the power of perseverance. Her father, a stoic man with a quiet dignity, often shared stories of his time in the military, not to glorify the war, but to teach her about resilience. Respect is earned, not given, he would tell her, his voice steady but firm. And for people like us, it's harder to earn, but that doesn't mean you stop trying. Those words echoed in Cynthia's mind as she navigated the challenges of her early career. From the moment she set foot in the Naval Academy, she knew she was entering a world that wasn't built with people like her in mind. The halls of the academy were filled with young men who came from families with long military lineages, their confidence buoyed by privilege and tradition. Cynthia, by contrast, had no such pedigree. She was an anomaly, one of the few women in her class, and one of even fewer black cadets. The first day at the academy was seared into her memory. As she walked into the orientation hall, she could feel the weight of 100 gazes, some curious, others dismissive. The whispers were subtle but unmistakable. Think she'll last a week. Not a chance. She's out of her league. Cynthia ignored the comments, her father's voice steadying her resolve. She threw herself into the rigorous training regimen, determined to prove that she belonged. The physical demands were grueling, the academic requirements relentless, but Cynthia excelled. She quickly gained a reputation for her sharp mind and unshakable focus, qualities that set her apart from her peers. Yet, despite her accomplishments, there were always those who doubted her. During one particularly grueling field exercise, a senior officer singled her out in front of the entire unit. "Taylor," he barked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you think you're cut out for this? Maybe you should sit this one out before you embarrass yourself." Cynthia felt the weight of his words like a punch to the gut, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. Her lungs burned, her muscles ached, but she pushed herself harder, completing the exercise with a steely determination that left no room for doubt. By the end of the day, she had silenced her detractors, not with words, but with action. Her tenacity earned her respect among some of her peers, but it also drew resentment from others. There were moments when she felt the sting of isolation, the unspoken barriers that kept her at arm's length from the camaraderie others seemed to share effortlessly. But instead of letting it dishearten her, Cynthia used it as fuel, channeling her energy into becoming the best version of herself. As the years went on, Cynthia climbed the ranks, each promotion a testament to her hard work and resilience. But with every step forward came new challenges. The higher she rose, the more visible she became, and with that visibility came scrutiny. There were always those who questioned her decisions, who second-guessed her strategies, who attributed her success to luck or favoritism rather than merit. One incident stood out vividly in her memory. It was during her tenure as a lieutenant commander, when she had been tasked with leading a critical naval operation in the Pacific. The mission was high stakes, requiring precision and careful coordination to neutralize a growing threat in the region. Cynthia had spent weeks poring over intelligence reports, crafting a strategy that was both bold and calculated. But during the briefing, one of her senior officers, a man with decades of experience and a reputation for being difficult, challenged her plan. "With all due respect, Lieutenant Commander," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism, "I'm not sure this strategy is practical. Perhaps someone with more experience should take the lead." The room fell silent, all eyes on Cynthia. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken doubts, but instead of backing down, she stood her ground. "With all due respect, sir," she replied, her voice steady but firm, "this strategy has been vetted and approved by the Joint Task Force. It is not only practical but necessary to achieve our objectives. I am confident in its success, and I expect the team to execute it with precision." Her words left no room for argument. The operation proceeded as planned, and the mission was a resounding success, earning her commendations from her superiors. But even then, she knew that her success wouldn't be enough to silence the doubters. It never was. Back in her plane seat, Cynthia let out a soft sigh. The memories of those early years were bittersweet, a reminder of how far she had come, but also of the relentless battles she had fought along the way. The summit she was heading to wasn't just another professional milestone. It was a symbol of everything she had worked for. Yet she knew that even now, at the height of her career, there would still be those who questioned her presence, who saw her as an anomaly rather than an equal. The plane began its descent, and Cynthia straightened in her seat, her mind shifting back to the task ahead. She had been invited to the summit not just as a participant, but as a keynote speaker, a recognition of her expertise and leadership. The weight of that responsibility wasn't lost on her. She knew that her words would carry more than just the authority of her rank. They would carry the hopes and aspirations of everyone who had ever felt like an outsider, fighting for a seat at the table. As the wheels touched down, Cynthia took a deep breath and reminded herself of the mantra that had carried her through every challenge. Walk into every room like you belong there, because you do. It was a lesson her father had taught her, and one she had lived by every day since. The car waiting for her at the airport was a sleek black sedan, its driver a uniformed officer who greeted her with a respectful nod. As they sped through the streets of Washington, D.C., Cynthia's thoughts turned to the summit. The room she was about to enter would be filled with the most powerful military leaders and diplomats from around the world, each bringing their own agendas and egos to the table. It was a high-stakes environment, one where every word, every gesture, carried weight. But Cynthia wasn't afraid. She had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this. As the car pulled up to the Grand Conference Center, she stepped out with the confidence of someone who had earned her place, not just through titles or accolades, but through a lifetime of resilience and determination. As she entered the building, her posture straight and her gaze unwavering, Cynthia knew one thing for certain. She didn't just belong here. She was here to lead. The unseen battlefield. The Grand Conference Center loomed before Cynthia Taylor like a fortress, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the Washington, D.C. skyline. Military personnel in sharp uniforms and dignitaries in tailored suits milled about the entrance, their conversations low but urgent. The summit was more than a gathering of leaders. It was a battleground of ideas, strategies, and egos, each vying for dominance. Cynthia adjusted her jacket and stepped forward, her suitcase rolling smoothly behind her. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Delegates from every corner of the world filled the expansive lobby, their voices blending into a hum of activity. The air was heavy with anticipation, charged by the knowledge that the discussions taking place over the next few days could redefine global security for years to come. Cynthia's arrival didn't go unnoticed. Heads turned as she walked through the crowd, her presence commanding attention not through spectacle, but through the quiet authority she carried. As she approached the registration desk, a young aide greeted her with a nervous smile. "Admiral Taylor, welcome. Your credentials have already been processed, and your room is ready for you. Commander Evans has requested to meet you in the briefing area before the opening session." Cynthia nodded, her tone brisk but polite. "Thank you. Lead the way." The aide guided her through the labyrinthine hallways of the center, past rooms buzzing with pre-session meetings and hushed discussions. Each step brought Cynthia closer to the heart of the summit, a place where alliances would be forged and rivalries laid bare. As they reached the briefing area, she spotted Commander Rachel Evans, her trusted colleague, standing by a large digital map of the globe. "Admiral." Rachel greeted her warmly, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "Good to see you. The room's already filling up, and the buzz around your keynote is strong. You've got their attention." Cynthia allowed herself a faint smile. Rachel's confidence was reassuring, but Cynthia knew the stakes were high. "Let's make sure we keep it," she replied. "What's the status on the preliminary discussions?" Rachel gestured to the map. "Tense, as expected. The usual power players are posturing, but there's significant interest in your proposed strategy for joint naval operations in the Pacific. The smaller nations are looking to you to level the playing field." Cynthia studied the map, her mind already working through the intricate web of alliances and rivalries. The Pacific region had become a flashpoint for global tensions, with contested waters and rising militarization threatening to destabilize the entire area. Her strategy, developed over months of meticulous planning, was designed to foster cooperation while maintaining a delicate balance of power. But selling it to a room full of skeptical leaders would be no small feat. "Any resistance I should be aware of?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. Rachel hesitated for a moment before answering. "The usual suspects. General Hathaway from the UK thinks the plan compromises too much, and Admiral Lei from China is pushing for a more unilateral approach. But the rest seem open," tentatively. Cynthia nodded, absorbing the information. It was nothing she hadn't anticipated. The art of leadership wasn't just about crafting the right strategy. It was about convincing others to see its value. And in a room where every participant had their own agenda, that was often the hardest part. As the briefing wrapped up, Rachel gave Cynthia a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You've got this, Admiral. They may doubt you at first, but they won't by the time you're done." Cynthia smiled faintly, appreciating the vote of confidence. "Thanks, Rachel. Let's get to it." The conference hall was a spectacle of grandeur, its high ceilings and massive windows designed to inspire awe. Rows of tables stretched across the room, each seat occupied by a high-ranking official or delegate. The sound of hushed conversations filled the space, but as Cynthia entered, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others critical, but none indifferent. She walked to the podium with measured steps, her posture straight, and her expression calm. Behind her, a large screen displayed the summit's logo, a symbol of unity and cooperation that belied the underlying tensions in the room. Cynthia took her place at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edge as she scanned the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear, "thank you for being here today. The challenges we face as a global community are daunting, but they are not insurmountable. Together, we have the power to shape a future defined by stability and cooperation, rather than conflict and division." Her opening words were met with polite nods, but Cynthia could sense the skepticism lingering in the room. She continued, her tone firm but measured, laying out the key points of her strategy for joint naval operations. Her plan emphasized collaboration, resource sharing, and a unified approach to addressing threats in the Pacific region. It was a bold vision, one that required trust and compromise, qualities that were often in short supply among the world's power players. As she spoke, Cynthia observed the reactions in the room. Some delegates leaned forward, their expressions attentive, while others crossed their arms or exchanged skeptical glances. General Hathaway, seated near the front, maintained a stony expression, his eyes narrowing slightly as she outlined the details of her proposal. Admiral Lai, on the other hand, watched her with a calculated gaze, his expression unreadable. When Cynthia finished, the room erupted into a flurry of muted conversations. She stood at the podium, her composure unshaken, as the first questions were directed her way. They came rapid fire, each one a test of her resolve. "Admiral Taylor," General Hathaway began, his tone clipped, "your plan requires a level of cooperation that, frankly, I find unrealistic. What assurances can you provide that participating nations will uphold their commitments?" Cynthia met his gaze evenly, her response measured. "General, I understand your concerns, but this plan is built on a foundation of mutual accountability. The mechanisms for oversight and enforcement are clearly outlined in the proposal, and they have been vetted by international legal experts. Trust is essential, but trust must also be earned through transparency and consistent action." Her answer was firm but diplomatic, leaving little room for further argument. Hathaway nodded grudgingly, his expression softening slightly. The next question came from a delegate representing a smaller Pacific nation. "Admiral, how will this strategy address the concerns of nations like ours, which lack the resources to contribute significantly to joint operations?" Cynthia's tone softened as she replied, "Your contributions are not measured by size alone. This strategy is designed to ensure that every participating nation has a voice and a role, regardless of their resources. Smaller nations bring unique perspectives and localized knowledge that are invaluable to the success of our collective efforts." Her response earned a murmur of approval from several delegates, a small but meaningful victory. The questions continued, each one a challenge, but Cynthia handled them with the confidence and clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating complex terrain. By the time the session concluded, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The skepticism that had greeted her at the beginning was now tempered by a growing respect. Delegates approached her afterward, some offering words of support, others still cautious but willing to engage. Cynthia knew the battle wasn't won yet, but the first step had been taken. As she left the conference hall, Rachel was waiting for her, a satisfied smile on her face. "You were brilliant, Admiral. They're talking about your plan in the corridors. It's already making waves." Cynthia allowed herself a brief moment of pride, but she knew there was no time to dwell on it. The summit was far from over, and the road ahead was fraught with challenges. But as she walked toward her next meeting, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just representing herself. She was representing everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she was determined to prove them wrong. The shadow of doubt. The applause from the morning session still lingered in the air as Admiral Cynthia Taylor exited the conference hall. Outside, the hum of conversations in various languages echoed through the vast atrium of the conference center. Delegates clustered in small groups, their expressions a mix of contemplation and cautious optimism. Cynthia walked past them with her head held high, her presence a quiet storm of authority. She'd earned their attention, but she knew respect was another matter entirely. Rachel Evans appeared at her side, her tablet in hand, and her expression a blend of satisfaction and urgency. "You've done well, Admiral," Rachel said as they walked. "The smaller nations are rallying behind your proposal, and some of the bigger players are starting to soften. Even Hathaway seemed less combative by the end." Cynthia gave a small nod, her mind already racing ahead to the next session. "Softening isn't enough," she replied. "We need commitments, agreements on paper. These discussions mean nothing without action." Rachel sighed, a wry smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Always the realist. Cynthia's lips quirked upward briefly, but her focus remained razor-sharp. "I didn't get here by being naive, Rachel. Let's make sure we have our talking points in place for the breakout sessions. The real work happens there." As they reached the quieter corridors leading to the private briefing rooms, Rachel peeled off to coordinate with their team. Cynthia continued alone, her steps measured but deliberate. She needed a moment of solitude, not to reflect, but to prepare. The summit was a battlefield, and while the morning session had been a victory, the war was far from over. The breakout sessions were where the real negotiations happened. In smaller rooms with fewer participants, egos clashed more openly, and deals were brokered in hushed tones. Cynthia entered the room for the Pacific strategy discussion, her gaze sweeping over the attendees. General Hathaway sat at one end of the table, his posture stiff and his expression guarded. Admiral Lai occupied a seat near the center, his calm demeanor betraying nothing. Representatives from smaller Pacific nations filled the remaining chairs, their eyes reflecting a mix of hope and apprehension. Cynthia took her place at the head of the table, her presence commanding without being overbearing. She began by reiterating the key points of her strategy, emphasizing the importance of unity in addressing the growing threats in the Pacific. Her voice was steady, her words carefully chosen to balance authority with inclusivity. But as the discussion progressed, the resistance became apparent. General Hathaway was the first to voice his concerns, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Admiral, while your proposal is undoubtedly thorough, I can't help but question its feasibility. The level of trust required for this kind of cooperation is, frankly, unrealistic. We've seen time and time again that alliances falter under pressure." Cynthia met his gaze evenly. "I understand your concerns, General, but this isn't about blind trust. It's about building a framework that ensures accountability and mutual benefit. The alternative is a fractured response that leaves us all vulnerable." Hathaway's expression remained skeptical, but he said nothing further. Admiral Lai was next to speak, his tone calm but laced with subtle criticism. "Admiral Taylor," he began, "your strategy places significant emphasis on shared intelligence and joint operations. While commendable in theory, it raises questions about sovereignty and operational security. How do you propose we address these concerns?" Cynthia took a moment before responding, her mind working quickly to craft a response that would address his concerns without compromising her position. "Admiral Lai, sovereignty and security are paramount, which is why the proposal includes safeguards for sensitive information and clearly defined roles for each participant. This isn't about diminishing individual capabilities. It's about enhancing our collective strength." Her answer was met with thoughtful nods from some of the smaller nation representatives, but Lai's expression remained unreadable. Cynthia knew she had made progress, but the battle was far from over. As the session ended, Cynthia lingered in the room, her thoughts racing. The resistance she had encountered was expected, but it still frustrated her. She had spent months crafting a strategy that balanced practicality with ambition, yet convincing others to see its value was an uphill battle. It wasn't just the merits of the plan that were under scrutiny. It was her. Cynthia was no stranger to being underestimated. Throughout her career, she had faced skeptics who questioned her abilities, not because of her qualifications, but because of her identity. A black woman in a position of power was still a rarity in many circles, and Cynthia knew that her presence disrupted the status quo. Some doubted her out of habit, others out of prejudice, but the result was the same. She had to work twice as hard to earn half as much respect. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Rachel stepped inside, her expression serious. "Admiral, we need to talk." Cynthia gestured for her to sit. "What's the situation?" Rachel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's been some chatter among the delegations. Some are questioning your leadership, not because of the strategy, but because they don't see you as traditional." Cynthia's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Meaning some of them are uncomfortable with the idea of a woman, especially a black woman, leading these discussions. They won't say it outright, of course, but it's there. You can feel it. Cynthia nodded slowly, her mind already processing the implications. This wasn't new, but it was still infuriating. She had dealt with this kind of bias her entire career, but it never got easier. "What's the temperature among our allies?" Cynthia asked. Rachel leaned forward, her voice lowering. "The smaller nations are fully behind you. They see you as a champion for their concerns, but the bigger players, they're circling. They're waiting for any sign of weakness." Cynthia straightened in her chair, her expression hardening. "Then we give them none." Rachel smiled faintly. "That's the Admiral Taylor I know." The afternoon session was another test of Cynthia's resolve. The larger hall was filled with an even more diverse audience, including media representatives and observers from non-participating nations. The atmosphere was tense, the stakes higher than ever. As Cynthia took the stage, she could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her, some filled with doubt, others with expectation. She began her address with a story, a personal anecdote about her father's time in Vietnam. She spoke of the challenges he had faced, not just in combat, but in navigating a military that often saw him as less than his peers. It was a story of resilience, of determination in the face of adversity, and as Cynthia spoke, she could see the shift in the room. The skeptical expression softened, replaced by something more open, more human. Her message was clear. Resilience wasn't just a personal trait. It was a necessity for survival in an uncertain world, and it was that resilience that would guide them through the challenges ahead. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. Cynthia stepped off the stage, her expression calm, but her heart pounding. She had won another battle, but the war was far from over. As she walked back to the private briefing area, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The shadow of doubt would always be there, but Cynthia knew one thing for certain. She wasn't fighting this battle for herself alone. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, and she wasn't about to let them down. Breaking the barrier. Cynthia Taylor stood in front of the mirror in her temporary office, straightening the lapel of her jacket. The crisp navy blue fabric of her civilian attire fit perfectly, exuding the professionalism and composure she had cultivated over decades. Yet as she stared at her reflection, the momentary quiet brought an unwelcome companion. Doubt. It wasn't the doubt of her abilities, that had been crushed long ago through sheer will and relentless effort, but the doubt of how her presence, no matter how qualified, was perceived. The afternoon's roundtable discussion had been particularly grueling. While the session had started with cautious optimism, it had devolved into a clash of egos as larger nations jockeyed for control. General Hathaway had been the loudest voice, interrupting her points with dismissive remarks veiled in diplomatic language. Admiral Lai had played the subtle game, raising questions that seemed cooperative on the surface, but were clearly designed to undermine her authority. Cynthia had met their challenges head-on, her tone measured, her responses precise. But beneath the surface, she could feel the undercurrents of resistance, not to her strategy, but to her. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Rachel Evans stepped inside, her expression betraying a mix of concern and determination. "Admiral," Rachel began, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk about Hathaway." Cynthia turned to face her, folding her arms. "What's his latest move?" Rachel's brows furrowed as she set her tablet on the desk. "He's been holding side meetings with some of the delegates, trying to push his own agenda. It's not blatant, but it's enough to create doubt about the feasibility of your strategy." Cynthia sighed, her frustration evident despite her calm exterior. "Of course he is. Hathaway thrives on playing politics, even when it's counterproductive. What's the sentiment among the smaller nations?" "They're still with you," Rachel replied. "If anything, Hathaway's maneuvering has only strengthened their resolve. They see you as their advocate, someone willing to stand up to the bigger players." Cynthia allowed herself a faint smile. "Good. We'll use that. If Hathaway wants to question my authority, he'll have to do it in the open, not in the shadows." Rachel hesitated, then added, "There's one more thing. Some of the media reps have been sniffing around, looking for a story. They've caught wind of the tension between you and Hathaway. If this gets out, it could overshadow the entire summit." Cynthia's smile faded. The media could be a powerful ally or a destructive force, depending on how the narrative was framed. She had always been careful to keep her focus on her work, but she knew the headlines would emphasize her identity over her expertise. First Black woman Admiral sparks controversy at international summit. The thought made her stomach turn. "Let them sniff," Cynthia said finally, her voice firm. "I'm not here to make headlines. I'm here to lead. If Hathaway wants a public fight, I'll give him one, but on my terms." Later that evening, the summit convened for an informal networking event, a chance for delegates to mingle and discuss issues outside the constraints of the conference hall. The setting was elegant, a sprawling banquet hall adorned with chandeliers and decorated in muted gold and ivory tones. Servers moved through the crowd, offering glasses of wine and trays of hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere was lively, but Cynthia could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. She moved through the room with practiced ease, engaging in polite conversations and listening to the concerns of smaller nation representatives. Many of them expressed gratitude for her leadership, their voices carrying a mix of hope and desperation. For them, her strategy wasn't just a plan, it was a lifeline. As Cynthia navigated the room, she caught sight of General Hathaway, surrounded by a small group of delegates. He was speaking animatedly, his booming voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. Cynthia couldn't hear his words, but she could see the way his audience nodded, their expressions a mix of agreement and doubt. Without hesitation, Cynthia approached the group, her stride confident and her posture commanding. Hathaway noticed her immediately, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Admiral Taylor," he said, his tone overly cordial. "Join us. We were just discussing the challenges of implementing such an ambitious strategy." Cynthia smiled politely, her eyes sharp. "I'd be happy to provide clarification, General. Ambition is necessary when addressing challenges of this magnitude. Playing it safe has never led to progress." Hathaway's expression tightened, but he maintained his facade. "Of course, Admiral. But ambition without practicality can be dangerous. We must ensure that our plans are realistic, not just idealistic." Cynthia met his gaze evenly. "Realism doesn't mean avoiding difficult decisions, General. It means acknowledging the complexity of the problem and addressing it head-on. My strategy is ambitious because the stakes demand it. Anything less would be a disservice to the nations relying on us." The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of others nearby. For a moment, Hathaway seemed ready to challenge her further, but he hesitated, his confidence wavering under the weight of her presence. Finally, he nodded, his tone begrudging. "You make a fair point, Admiral." Satisfied, Cynthia turned her attention to the other delegates, redirecting the conversation to the specifics of her proposal. As she spoke, she could see the shift in their expressions, the skepticism giving way to interest. Hathaway remained silent, his earlier bravado diminished. After the event, Cynthia returned to her room, the day's battles weighing heavily on her. She sank into the armchair by the window, gazing out at the city lights. The confrontation with Hathaway had been a small victory, but it was just one skirmish in a larger war. She couldn't afford to lose focus, not now when so much was at stake. Her thoughts drifted to her father, his words a steady anchor in her mind. "You walk into every room like you belong there, because you do." He had faced his own battles, fighting for respect in a military that often refused to see him as an equal. Cynthia had inherited his resilience, but she also carried the weight of his sacrifices. As she sat in the quiet of her room, Cynthia allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. The path she had chosen was a lonely one, filled with constant scrutiny and relentless expectations. But she had made a promise to herself, long ago, to never back down. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. "Tomorrow's session will be the deciding factor. You're ready, Admiral." They're starting to see it. Cynthia smiled faintly, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow, she would stand before the summit once again, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of everything she had fought for. The barriers she faced were real, but so was her determination to break them. With that thought, she rose from the chair, her posture straight and her gaze steady. The battle wasn't over, but Cynthia Taylor was ready. She always was. Victory on the edge. The morning of the final session arrived with a quiet intensity. Cynthia Taylor stood by the window of her suite, watching the sunrise paint the Washington skyline in shades of orange and gold. The city, so steeped in history and power, seemed to pulse with energy as the summit's climax approached. Today was the day that would decide everything, whether her strategy would be adopted or discarded, and whether her leadership would be vindicated or further scrutinized. She took a deep breath, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her strategy. It wasn't even about the summit. It was about breaking through the walls of doubt and prejudice that had shadowed her every step. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, her movements deliberate and precise, before heading out the door. The conference center buzzed with anticipation as delegates filled the grand hall for the final session. Unlike the previous days, the air was charged with a sense of urgency. Decisions would be made today, decisions that could reshape global alliances and military strategies. Cynthia walked through the crowd, her presence drawing a mix of gazes, some respectful, others wary, but all attentive. She had become the focal point of the summit, and she intended to rise to the occasion. Rachel Evans met her at the entrance to the conference room, her expression both anxious and encouraging. "Admiral, the room's on edge. Hathaway's been making his rounds again, trying to rally opposition, but it's not working as well as he hoped. Your speech yesterday left an impression." Cynthia nodded, her resolve unshaken. "Impressions won't be enough, Rachel. We need action. Let's make sure everyone knows what's at stake." Rachel handed her a folder containing the final agenda. "The smaller nations are prepared to back your proposal. They've even drafted a joint statement of support. But you'll need to sway at least one of the bigger players to secure a majority." "Then that's what I'll do," Cynthia said firmly. "Let's get started." The hall was packed, every seat occupied, as Cynthia took her place at the head of the table. She scanned the room, her gaze steady and unyielding. General Hathaway sat to her left, his posture rigid and his expression cold. Admiral Lai was on her right, his calm demeanor betraying none of his thoughts. The rest of the delegates filled the long table, their faces a mosaic of anticipation and skepticism. Cynthia began with a brief recap of the discussions from the past days, her voice steady and authoritative. She didn't shy away from the challenges that had been raised, addressing each concern with precision and clarity. Her words were not just a defense of her strategy, but a rallying call for unity. "We face an unprecedented challenge," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "The Pacific region is on the brink of destabilization, and the consequences will ripple across the globe. This isn't just about protecting territories or resources. It's about safeguarding the future of international security. If we fail to act decisively, we all lose." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, The room was silent. Then the questions began, each one a test of her resolve. Hathaway was the first to speak, his tone sharp and critical. "Admiral, your plan relies heavily on cooperation between nations with conflicting interests. How do you propose to overcome those divisions when history has shown us that such alliances are fragile at best?" Cynthia met his gaze, unflinching. "General, history has also shown us that the greatest achievements come from overcoming divisions. This plan isn't about erasing differences. It's about finding common ground and building a framework that ensures accountability and mutual benefit. It's not easy, but it's necessary." Admiral Lee followed, his question more measured but no less challenging. "Your proposal includes shared intelligence and joint operations, which could expose vulnerabilities. How do you address the risk of sensitive information being misused?" Cynthia's response was firm. "Admiral, the safeguards in this strategy are designed to minimize those risks. Shared intelligence is compartmentalized, with strict protocols for access and usage. The benefits of collaboration far outweigh the potential risks, and those risks are mitigated through transparency and trust." The discussions continued, each question met with Cynthia's unwavering composure. As the hours passed, the tone of the room began to shift. The smaller nations voiced their support, their representatives speaking with a sense of urgency and conviction. They framed Cynthia's strategy as not just a solution, but a necessity, a lifeline for nations that lacked the resources to stand alone. One by one, the delegates began to align. Even Admiral Lee, who had remained neutral throughout the summit, leaned forward, his tone softening. "Admiral Taylor, your proposal is ambitious, but ambition is what we need in times of crisis. I believe it warrants our support." Hathaway, however, was not so easily swayed. "I remain unconvinced," he said, his voice carrying a stubborn edge. "This plan is a gamble, and I'm not willing to bet my country's security on an untested framework." Cynthia turned to him, her gaze piercing. "General, doing nothing is a far greater gamble. The threats we face will not wait for us to sort out our differences. Leadership requires risk, but it also requires vision. This isn't about protecting one country's security. It's about securing the future for all of us." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Hathaway leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though the tension would break into open conflict, but then he gave a reluctant nod. "Very well," he said, his tone begrudging. "I'll support the plan, but I reserve the right to revisit it if the results aren't as promised." It wasn't a resounding victory, but it was enough. Cynthia allowed herself a small nod, her relief hidden beneath her composed exterior. The final vote was unanimous. As the delegates signed the agreement, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to cautious optimism. Cynthia stood at the podium, watching as her vision became reality. It was a hard-won victory, but it was one that would resonate far beyond the walls of the conference center. Rachel approached her after the session, her expression a mix of pride and exhaustion. "You did it, Admiral. They're calling it a historic moment." Cynthia smiled faintly, her voice calm but firm. "It's a step forward, Rachel, but the real work begins now." As she left the hall, the weight of the summit began to lift, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. Cynthia Taylor had not just proven herself as a leader, she had redefined what leadership could look like. And while the road ahead was still filled with challenges, she knew one thing for certain. She belonged at the table, and no one could take that from her. The sun was setting as she stepped outside, the city bathed in a warm golden light. For the first time in days, Cynthia allowed herself a moment to breathe, her shoulders relaxing as she looked out at the horizon. She had fought for this moment, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she had won, breaking through and building bridges. As the final session adjourned, the applause in the room echoed like a thunderstorm. Cynthia Taylor stood at the podium, her posture firm and her expression calm, though inside, a wave of emotion surged. The delegates, from the smallest Pacific nations to the most powerful global players, were on their feet, their clapping not just an acknowledgement of her strategy, but a recognition of her leadership. She stepped back from the podium, letting the applause wash over her without breaking her composed demeanor. This was a moment she had worked her entire career to achieve, yet she knew it was only the beginning. When the applause subsided, the room emptied gradually, delegates retreating to discuss the implications of the agreement or prepare for their departures. Cynthia stayed behind, watching as the room that had been a battlefield of words and ideologies began to quiet. Rachel Evans joined her a moment later, her expression a mix of pride and exhaustion. "Admiral, they're already calling it the Taylor Doctrine in the hallways," she said with a small grin. "You've made history." Cynthia allowed herself a brief smile, though her mind was already focused on the next steps. "History is only meaningful if it leads to action, Rachel. We've secured the agreement, but now comes the hard part: implementation." Rachel nodded, her admiration evident. "You never let yourself rest, do you?" "Rest is a luxury," Cynthia replied, "and there's still too much at stake." Later that evening, Cynthia found herself in a quiet corner of the conference center's lounge, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The day's events played in her mind like a film reel. The resistance, the questions, the breakthroughs, and finally, the reluctant nod from General Hathaway that sealed the deal. It had taken every ounce of her resolve to navigate the treacherous waters of diplomacy and ego, but she had done it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "Admiral Taylor." Cynthia looked up to see Admiral Lai standing a few feet away, his expression uncharacteristically open. He gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "May I join you?" "Of course," Cynthia said, motioning for him to sit. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of conversation from other corners of the lounge filled the silence. Finally, Admiral Lai broke the quiet. "I wanted to say that I underestimated you," he admitted, his tone sincere. "Your strategy is not just ambitious, it's visionary. I spent much of my career guarding my nation's interests, often at the expense of collaboration. Today, you reminded me of the power of unity." Cynthia studied him for a moment before responding. "Thank you, Admiral Lai. I appreciate your honesty. But unity isn't just a strategy. It's a necessity. The challenges we face are too large for any one nation to handle alone." Lai nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I suppose I've been too focused on what could go wrong to see what could go right. Your leadership has given me a new perspective." The two exchanged a few more words before Lai excused himself, leaving Cynthia alone with her thoughts. The conversation was a small but significant victory, a bridge built where there had once been a divide. The next morning, as the summit officially concluded, Cynthia prepared to leave. The delegates had dispersed, the agreement signed, and the first steps toward implementation underway. As she stood in the lobby, waiting for her car, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of her father, whose quiet strength and wisdom had been her foundation. She thought of the countless battles she had fought, some on the field, others in boardrooms, and many within herself. Each one had shaped her, honed her, and prepared her for this moment. When the car arrived, Cynthia stepped outside, the crisp morning air invigorating her. As she slid into the back seat, she glanced at the conference center one last time, a faint smile playing on her lips. This summit had been a victory, but it was only one chapter in a much larger story. As the car pulled away, she leaned back and closed her eyes, her mind already turning to the challenges ahead. There were still barriers to break, bridges to build, and battles to fight. But Cynthia Taylor was ready, as she always had been. She belonged, not just at the table, but at the head of it. And she wasn't just leading for herself. She was leading for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for those who would follow in her footsteps, and for the future she believed in so deeply. Because leadership wasn't about power or prestige. It was about resilience, vision, and the courage to push forward when the world pushed back. And as Cynthia Taylor's car disappeared into the morning traffic, the legacy she was building continued to grow, one step at a time.